He came with just 180 men and brought down an empire of millions. In a clash of worlds high in the Andes, blood met gold, faith met empire, and history was forever changed. This is the true story of how Francisco Pizarro conquered the mighty Inca Empire. High in the Andes, long before a Spaniard set foot in the Americas, the Inca Empire stood as one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. Known as Tawantinsuyu, or the Four Regions United, the empire stretched over 2,500 miles, from modern-day Colombia in the north to Chile in the south. With its capital in Cusco, the Inca realm ruled over more than 12 million people across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. At the heart of this vast dominion was an intricate network of roads, bridges, and messengers, the Chasquis, who relayed information across mountain passes and jungle trails with astonishing speed. The Inca road system rivaled that of ancient Rome, connecting highland cities to coastal valleys, fortresses to farmlands, temples to gold-laden tombs. Their cities weren't just clusters of huts. They were engineered marvels. Machu Picchu, perched on a mountaintop, blended seamlessly into its environment with stonework so precise that no mortar was needed. Terraced fields and irrigation canals allowed agriculture to flourish even on sheer slopes. The Incas grew maize, potatoes, quinoa, and coca, feeding millions and storing surpluses in mountaintop warehouses. But it was not just technology that held the empire together. It was ideology. The emperor, known as the Sapa Inca, was believed to be the living son of the sun god Inti. His word was divine, and below him flowed a strict hierarchy of nobles, priests, engineers, artisans, and farmers. There was no money. Labor was the currency. Through a system called mitha, every citizen owed work to the empire, on farms, in mines, building roads or temples. The Inca had no written language, yet they managed vast records through quipus, bundles of knotted cords whose colors, lengths, and patterns recorded taxes, census data, and historical events. Oral tradition was sacred, passed down by trained storytellers known as amautas. Religiously, the Inca worshipped the sun, moon, mountains, and the spirits of nature. Apus, believing their ancestors lived among them. Sacrifices, including llamas and occasionally humans, were made to appease the gods, especially during times of drought or eclipse. But the empire was not without shadows. Expansion often came through war and forced resettlement, as conquered tribes were uprooted and relocated to weaken resistance. Rebellions were crushed, and loyalty to the Sapa Inca was non-negotiable. By the early 1500s, the Inca had never heard of Spain, nor imagined that men in metal armor would soon walk their sacred plazas. In the minds of the Inca, the world was balanced. The emperor ruled with divine favor. The gods were pleased. The crops were strong. The empire seemed eternal. But across the ocean, storms were already forming. Ships were setting sail. And on the horizon, unseen, unimagined, rode the horse riders who would bring it all to an end. In the early 1520s, whispers began to stir along the western fringes of the Inca world. Strange men had been seen, tall, bearded, wrapped in metal, riding beasts no Andean eyes had ever known. They came from the sea in floating houses. They wielded thunder and flame in their hands. Some locals said they could not die. These rumors drifted slowly from the northern coast of modern-day Ecuador into the Inca interior, carried by traders, messengers, and frightened fishermen. No one knew what to make of them. Some said the men were gods. Others believed they were monsters. But none could ignore the signs that something was changing. The Inca Empire had expanded rapidly in the century preceding the Spanish arrival, absorbing rival tribes and solidifying its grip through both diplomacy and force. But that expansion also left the empire fragile. Many of the newly conquered peoples remained resentful. Their loyalty to Cusco was thin. Their hatred for the Sapa Inca ran deep. It was in this atmosphere of silent tension that the Spanish made their first forays along the Peruvian coast. In 1526, Francisco Pizarro, a little-known Spanish soldier and explorer, arrived off the coast of Tumbes with a small expedition. What he saw astonished him. Stone cities, well-dressed nobles, gold ornaments, and complex irrigation systems. Unlike anything he had encountered in the Caribbean or Central America, this was clearly no savage wilderness. This was an empire. But Pizarro's first contact was cautious. Disease, unfamiliar terrain, and limited supplies forced his retreat. He returned to Panama and then to Spain, where he secured royal approval to conquer this fabled land. When he came back in 1531, he was no longer a cautious explorer. He was an authorized conqueror. Meanwhile, along the coast, the Inca administrators had not remained idle. Reports from Tumbes and elsewhere described the strange visitors and their frightening weapons. But the empire, stretched thin and still recovering from a brutal civil war, did not act decisively. Atahualpa, the Sapa Inca, was consolidating power in the north after defeating his brother Huascar in a savage internal struggle. He saw no urgent threat from a handful of foreigners far from the capital. There was also confusion rooted in prophecy. Among many Andean peoples, a legend existed of Viracocha, a white-bearded deity who had created the world and promised to return one day from across the ocean. To some, Pizarro and his men fit this image, whether by coincidence or clever manipulation. The Spanish, aware of these myths, would later exploit them ruthlessly. But what truly allowed the Spanish to press forward was the belief that they were few, disorganized, and insignificant. That belief would prove fatal. In the highlands, life continued. Temples were filled with offerings, nobles gave speeches, and workers toiled on imperial projects. But the tide was rising, and the first wave had already touched the shore. The Incas had seen the shadows. They had not yet seen the storm. In the final years of the 1520s, the mighty Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, spanned more than 2,500 miles along the Andes, the largest empire ever seen in the Americas. From the highland capital of Cusco to the forests of the Amazon and the deserts of northern Chile, its network of roads, messengers, temples, and governors projected the authority of the Sapa Inca like the rays of the sun, God Inti himself. But no empire, no matter how vast, is immune to collapse from within. The seeds of destruction were planted not by Spanish steel, but by a virus, a silent invader that preceded the conquistadors by years. Smallpox, introduced to the Americas by earlier Spanish expeditions in the Caribbean and Central America, had crept southward with devastating speed. It struck the Inca heartland in the late 1520s, claiming thousands of lives, including the sitting emperor, Huayna Capac, and his chosen heir, Ninan Cuyochi. In the vacuum left behind, the empire tore itself apart. Two sons rose to stake their claim: Huascar, the legitimate heir raised in Cusco, and Atahualpa, his half-brother, born of a secondary wife and based in the northern city of Quito. Though Huascar held the political center of power, Atahualpa controlled experienced armies from the north of the frontier, men hardened by years of warfare against unconquered tribes. The question was no longer one of succession. It was a question of survival. Huascar, deeply traditional and fiercely authoritarian, demanded total loyalty from all corners of the empire. His court in Cusco viewed Atahualpa as a usurper, an illegitimate child of an illegitimate region. He sent envoys north with threats and ultimatums. Atahualpa ignored them. His pride and his generals told him he was the rightful ruler. By 1529, diplomacy gave way to violence. Civil war erupted across the spine of the Andes. Atahualpa's generals, Chalcuchimac and Quizquiz, led relentless campaigns southward. Their armies were well-disciplined and ruthless. They sacked city after city, using scorched earth tactics to demoralize Huascar's supporters. Entire provinces switched allegiance, either out of fear or frustration with Cusco's rigid demands. Huascar retaliated with equal brutality. Loyalist forces executed northern sympathizers, burned temples that harbored Atahualpa's name, and tortured nobles suspected of betrayal. But Huascar's forces lacked cohesion. His commanders bickered, his strategy was reactive, and worst of all, his cruelty alienated the very people he needed. The war, though fought in the name of two brothers, became a struggle over the soul of the empire itself. And all the while, as blood soaked the highland valleys and trade routes crumbled, the empire's outer provinces grew restless. Some began to question why they bled for an empire that treated them like subjects, not allies. The fragile loyalty that had held Tawantinsuyu together under Huayna Capac began to fracture. The decisive moment came in April 1532 at the Battle of Quipaipan, west of Cusco. Atahualpa's army, marching with relentless precision, met Huascar's forces in a final, brutal clash. The battle was a massacre. Huascar was captured, his nobles executed, and his capital thrown into chaos. The armies of the north swept through Cusco like a flood. Atahualpa did not enter the city immediately. Instead, he remained in the northern town of Cajamarca, holding his brother captive. There, he would solidify his victory and plan his formal coronation. But fate had other ideas. Even as Atahualpa feasted and received tributes from across the fractured empire, a storm approached from the west. Francisco Pizarro, long absent from the narrative, had returned, this time not as an explorer, but as a conqueror. He and fewer than 200 Spaniards, armed with steel, muskets, horses, and a ruthless will, landed on the Peruvian coast and marched inland. They were few, but the empire was bleeding. Atahualpa, fresh from victory, saw no threat in a ragged group of foreign invaders. He agreed to meet them in Cajamarca. He did not yet understand that the civil war, though won, had left him exposed. His army was scattered. His empire was divided. His enemies, internal and external, were watching, and the Spanish were ready to strike. The city of Cajamarca, nestled in the northern highlands of Peru, was quiet on the morning of November 15, 1532. Its plazas were broad. Its streets were clean. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and messengers moved swiftly, their sandals slapping the stone. To the people of the Inca world, it was a place of healing, home to sacred hot springs that once drew emperors. But that day, it would become the site of an ambush that shattered an empire. Atahualpa, now victorious in the Inca Civil War, had paused his march toward Cusco. He remained encamped outside Cajamarca with over 80,000 troops, enjoying the spoils of war and preparing to take the throne formally. His brother Huascar was in chains. His rivals were scattered. The empire lay at his feet. He believed he had time to rest, time to consolidate power, time to rule. But just beyond the city walls, a strange new enemy had arrived. Francisco Pizarro, a hardened veteran of conquest, led a force of just 168 Spaniards. They had muskets, swords, pikes, and horses. Tools of terror to a people who had never seen metal that didn't shine in temples, beasts that galloped like thunder, or men who killed from a distance. Pizarro had not come for trade, nor peace. He came for the riches of an empire rumored to rival any in Europe. And he brought with him a plan soaked in calculation and cruelty. He sent word to Atahualpa, requesting a meeting in the city's central plaza. A peaceful exchange of greetings, an offering of friendship. Pizarro posed as a humble envoy of the Spanish king, Charles V. He downplayed his numbers, flattered the Sapa Inca, feigned reverence. Atahualpa was amused. These foreigners, bearded, dirty, armored like insects, were interesting curiosities. He had heard of their weapons, their animals, their battles further north. But he had just crushed the most powerful armies of the Andes. What could 168 men possibly do? He accepted the invitation. His decision would prove catastrophic. On November 16th, as the sun crested the mountains, Atahualpa prepared to enter Cajamarca. He wore robes of gold and emerald. He was carried on a litter, surrounded by thousands of unarmed attendants, dancers, and nobles. It was not an army. It was a parade, a show of imperial majesty, a warning to foreigners, not through threats, but through spectacle. But Pizarro was not awed. He had hidden his men inside the city's walls, in empty buildings, behind windows, within alleys. Artillery was loaded, horses saddled, blades drawn. The plaza had been turned into a trap. He placed Fray Vicente de Valverde, a Dominican friar, at the front. The friar carried a cross in one hand and a Bible in the other. When Atahualpa arrived at the center of the square, he was greeted not by gifts, but by demands. The friar stepped forward and told the emperor he must submit to the authority of the Pope and the King of Spain. Atahualpa, confused and insulted, asked where this authority came from. The friar handed him a Bible. According to Spanish accounts, Atahualpa examined it, held it to his ear, and when it didn't speak, threw it to the ground. That single act, whether myth or truth, became the excuse for what followed. Fray Valverde cried out to Pizarro, "To arms!" Cannons roared, muskets cracked, horses charged, steel flashed. From every side, the hidden Spaniards surged into the square. The Inca entourage was trapped. Their attendants, unarmed and unarmored, were slaughtered by the hundreds. Screams filled the plaza. Llamas bolted. Blood painted the stones. The litter buckled. Atahualpa fell into chaos. The emperor, stunned and disoriented, was dragged from the carnage by Spanish soldiers. He was not killed, not yet. He was taken alive. Pizarro knew his actual prize was not the slaughter of warriors, but the capture of a god king. By nightfall, the square was silent. Thousands of Incas lay dead. Not a single Spaniard had fallen. And Atahualpa, the living son of the Andes, the divine ruler of the greatest empire in the Americas, was a prisoner in a foreigner's hands. The room still stands. In the heart of Cajamarca, enclosed by thick stone walls and washed by the mountain sun, sits a chamber with faint markings scratched into the stone. It is said to be the spot where Atahualpa, captive emperor of the Inca Empire, stood and stretched his arm to the wall, offering the most fabulous ransom the world had ever known. And he meant every word. After the ambush in Cajamarca, Atahualpa was humiliated but not broken. Though bound and held in a foreigner's quarters, he remained calculating, regal, and resolute. He understood that these strange men were not just warriors. They were merchants of greed. Their eyes lingered not on his gods, but on his ornaments, not on his titles, but on his gold. So he made them an offer that would change the course of history. Atahualpa told Francisco Pizarro he would fill the room in which he was held. 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and over 8 feet high, with gold. Not once, but once with gold, and twice more with silver, up to the mark his hand traced on the wall. In return, he asked for his freedom. Pizarro agreed. It was a deal forged not in honor, but in hunger. Messengers were dispatched across the empire. Gold was stripped from temples, statues, ceremonial masks, and palaces. Silver was carried in baskets, melted into ingots, or shaped into plates. From Cusco to Quito, the Inca world mobilized not for war, but for tribute. The treasures came in caravans, llamas and porters arriving by the hundreds. Priests wept as sacred icons were dismantled. Nobles despaired as family heirlooms were surrendered. But Atahualpa had spoken, and the empire obeyed. In all, the ransom amounted to over 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver, worth hundreds of millions by today's standards. It remains the most enormous ransom ever paid for a single individual. But as the gold stacked higher, so did the Spaniards' paranoia. They had come as invaders, but were now surrounded by tens of thousands of Inca warriors. Though Atahualpa remained compliant, his influence extended beyond the walls. Messages passed through his hands. Decisions were made in whispers. He was a captive, yes, but he was still the Sapa Inca. Tensions grew among the Spaniards. Some feared an uprising. Others wanted the treasure divided. And some, like Diego de Almagro, Pizarro's ambitious rival, believed that with Atahualpa alive, Spain's control would never be secure. Pizarro, caught between promise and pressure, hesitated. He had given his word, but he had also seized an empire's god, and gods, once freed, often seek revenge. And so the conspiracy began. Pizarro convened a sham trial. Atahualpa was charged with ludicrous offenses: plotting insurrection, idolatry, polygamy, and fratricide. Never mind that the Spanish practiced polygamy in secret, followed their own idols, and had just waged war against their own kings. The verdict was preordained. The trial was a theater. On July 26, 1533, the execution was set. Atahualpa was offered a grim choice: burned at the stake as a pagan, or strangled with a garrote if he accepted baptism into the Christian faith. He chose the latter. He was baptized Juan, named after a Spanish saint he never knew. Then, under a starless sky, the last sovereign of the Inca Empire was choked to death with a wooden collar, surrounded by foreign swords and foreign prayers. He died not on a battlefield, but in captivity, betrayed after giving away the wealth of the gods. And what of the ransom? It was melted down. Sacred chalices, masks, and effigies were thrown into furnaces. Gold is hammered into bars, silver pressed into coins, culture transformed into currency. In the end, it took only 3 days to destroy what took generations to build. Each Spaniard received a fortune, roughly 90 pounds of gold, and 180 pounds of silver each. Horses were assigned shares. So were enslaved people. Even those who had stayed behind in Panama or Spain received their cut. But no one, not even Pizarro, walked away unchanged. The Inca gods were silenced, their sun extinguished, the ransom room was empty, and the empire would never rise again. The roads that led to Cusco, once swept by golden litters and royal messengers, now echoed with the metallic rhythm of foreign boots and hooves. The Spaniards, now heavy with plunder and stained with betrayal, turned their eyes to the heart of the Inca world, the imperial capital, Cusco. At its peak, Cusco was no ordinary city. It was the navel of the world, as the Inca called it, a sacred center where the sun's power was focused. The gods were honored, and the Sapa Inca reigned supreme. Its stonework rivaled the pyramids in precision. Its temples shimmered with gold. Its people believed it to be eternal. Now it was a target. But Cusco was not yet theirs. With Atahualpa dead, the Spaniards no longer had a puppet emperor to manipulate. The empire was fractured, yes, but not broken. Inca generals, loyal nobles, and scattered factions still held territory. In many corners, resistance brewed. Pizarro, ever strategic, needed a new figurehead. He installed Tupac Hualpa, a young Inca noble of royal blood, as a pliable successor. With Spanish backing, Tupac was declared emperor, but his power was hollow. He was viewed with suspicion by his own people and died mysteriously soon after, likely poisoned, either by loyalist Incas or rival Spaniards who found him inconvenient. Still, with the illusion of imperial continuity in place, Pizarro marched forward. As they advanced through the Andes, the terrain turned hostile. Snow-capped mountains loomed. Narrow passes twisted along cliffs. Rivers ran deep and fast. And though many local lords, shaken by Atahualpa's fate, surrendered out of fear, others resisted. Ambushes cut through the columns. Bolas, weighted cords used by Andean warriors, took down horses. Stones rained from the heights. But the Spanish pressed on. In November 1533, less than a year after they first entered Cajamarca, the Spaniards arrived at Cusco's gates. The city, though defended by loyalist troops, was not prepared for a full assault. The Incas had not expected Pizarro to move so quickly, nor had they recovered from the confusion and grief of their emperor's execution. The battle for Cusco was brutal but brief. Spanish cavalry charged through narrow streets, sabers cutting through warriors armed with slings and spears. Gunpowder cracked in the sacred air. Fires spread across the city. Temples that once echoed with chants now filled with smoke and screams. By the time the fighting ended, Cusco had fallen. What followed was not conquest, but desecration. The Temple of the Sun, once covered in gold plates so dazzling that it blinded onlookers, was stripped. Golden panels depicting stars, suns, and lunar cycles, each meticulously crafted, were torn from the walls. The Coricancha, the holiest site in Inca religion, was reduced to looted stone. The palaces of noble families were seized. Royal mummies, once paraded through streets and treated as living ancestors, were burned or hidden away. Spanish soldiers carved out residences among the sacred ruins. Churches were built on temples. Crosses were planted where gods once stood. And yet, for all the glory, Cusco offered the Spaniards no peace. They ruled a city in mourning. The people complied, but their eyes burned with memory. They bowed, but their hearts did not break. Pizarro attempted to stabilize the region. He appointed Manco Inca Yupanqui, another royal noble, as a puppet ruler, hoping to maintain a thin layer of legitimacy. But Manco, unlike his predecessors, observed. He bowed deeper, smiled more, and waited. For even as the Spanish reveled in their victory, the empire's soul stirred underground. Outside the walls of Cusco, resistance gathered. Messengers ran across mountain ridges. Rebel camps formed in the sacred valleys. The blood of gods had soaked the earth, and it would not stay silent for long. But for now, the banner of Castile flew over Cusco. The most fantastic city of the Andes, engineered with divine precision and cosmic alignment, had been brought low. And Francisco Pizarro, a man born illegitimate and obscure in Extremadura, now ruled the navel of a fallen world. The fires of Cusco had barely cooled before the seeds of rebellion were sown. Manco Inca Yupanqui, the Spaniards' new puppet emperor, watched as his kingdom was carved up before his eyes. Temples looted. Women taken. Nobles were beaten in the streets by foreign men who claimed divine right through steel and gold. At first, he played the part of the obedient figurehead, smiling when summoned, nodding when ordered. But behind his mask, the blood of Inca emperors boiled. Pizarro may have thought he'd won, but he had merely silenced a storm. By 1536, Manco had seen enough. He escaped Cusco under the guise of a religious pilgrimage. Outside the city, his disguise fell away. What he revealed to the world was not submission, but resistance. He rallied the scattered remnants of the Inca army, sent runners into every surviving province, and called forth warriors from the sacred valleys, from the jungles of Vilcabamba, from mountaintops that had never bowed to Spain. Across the Andes, fires were lit. Horns sounded. The sleeping empire awoke. Then came the assault. In May 1536, a wave of tens of thousands of Inca warriors descended upon Cusco, now occupied by a few hundred Spaniards and their native allies. It was an overwhelming force, one the conquistadors never expected to face again. The city was surrounded. All exits were cut off. Spanish soldiers climbed the towers in desperation and watched the horizon darken with smoke, banners bearing the sun god Inti. It was a siege of vengeance. From the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, perched high above the city, Inca slingers rained stones on the invaders. Spanish supply lines were severed. Horses grew weak. Food dwindled. Morale broke. Manco's forces set fire to the city's outer districts. Flames engulfed Spanish homes built atop temples. The very stones cried out as their builders struck back. Cusco, captive, violated, disgraced, now became a battlefield once more. Inside the city, the Spaniards fought with desperation. Every wall became a last stand. Every alley is a war zone. Even the Pizarro brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, found themselves trapped and bloodied, calling for reinforcements that might never come. But the Inca had a weakness. No cavalry. Spanish horses, though fewer in number, broke enemy lines again and again. Arquebuses roared. Steel sliced through the cotton armor of the Andean warriors. What the Inca had in numbers, the Spaniards countered with technology and brutality. Weeks passed, then months. The siege dragged on, but the tide began to turn. Spanish reinforcements finally arrived from Lima. Manco's grip began to loosen. The fortress of Sacsayhuaman, key to the siege, fell to a daring night assault led by the Spaniards. Its defenders fought to the death, many leaping from its towers rather than surrender. The noose around Cusco unraveled. Realizing the battle was lost, for now, Manco withdrew. But this was no surrender. It was a retreat into the sacred refuge of Vilcabamba, deep in the jungle. There, he established a neo-Inca state, a defiant spark in the shadows, keeping the flame of resistance alive. The rebellion had failed to retake Cusco, but it proved a truth the Spaniards could no longer deny. The Inca spirit was unbroken. The siege of Cusco marked the most significant uprising the Spanish had faced in the Americas up to that point. It revealed the lie at the heart of conquest, that fear and force were enough to erase civilizations. Manco Inca would become more than a rebel. He would become a symbol, a reminder that no empire dies quietly. And as the Spanish tightened their grip on Peru, they now looked over their shoulders. For in the jungles of Vilcabamba, the last breath of the empire waited patiently, sharpening its teeth. Hidden deep within the folds of the Andean jungle, beyond rivers that twisted like serpents and cliffs that seemed carved by gods, there lay a secret citadel. Vilcabamba. To the Spanish, it was a rumor, a whisper, a shadow in the mist. But to the Inca, it was salvation. After the failed siege of Cusco, Manco Inca Yupanqui led what remained of his loyal forces into this remote sanctuary. There, he founded the Neo-Inca state, a sovereign fragment of the old empire, untouched for decades. In Vilcabamba, the Incas would resist Spanish domination not just with swords, but with survival. It was more than a hideout. It was a capital of defiance. The jungle was their ally. Spanish horses faltered in the mud. Firearms rusted in the moisture. Their maps turned blank at Vilcabamba's borders, as though the land itself rejected foreign conquest. The Inca, born of high altitudes and harsh terrain, thrived in the wild. They knew every gorge, every vine, every hiding place where the sun touched only once a day. From this bastion, Manco Inca continued his resistance. He launched raids on nearby Spanish outposts, disrupted trade routes, and sent messengers to rally scattered indigenous allies. The empire, though cracked and bleeding, had not vanished. It had merely changed its skin. Spanish attempts to subdue Vilcabamba repeatedly failed. Even when they captured and tortured Inca messengers or offered rewards for Manco's capture, no betrayal came. The loyalty he inspired in his people was ironclad. But time, like the jungle, is relentless. In 1544, Manco Inca was assassinated, not by Spaniards, but by former Spanish fugitives he had taken in. The betrayal was swift and personal. But before they could escape, his Inca guards slaughtered them, and his death became martyrdom. His son, Sayri Tupac, succeeded him. But unlike his father, Sayri Tupac negotiated with the Spanish. In 1558, after years in exile, he accepted an offer of safe passage and a royal pension in exchange for leaving Vilcabamba and settling in Cusco under Spanish oversight. It was a controversial move, viewed by many Incas as a sign of submission. And yet, the Neo-Inca state endured. Leadership passed to Sayri's brother, Titu Cusi Yupanqui, who resumed guerrilla resistance and refused to be a vassal to Spain. Though he too entertained negotiations, at times even allowing Jesuit priests into Vilcabamba, the core of the resistance remained firm. By the time Tupac Amaru, the last son of Manco Inca, took the mantle in the 1570s, Vilcabamba had become more than a fortress. It had become a myth, a ghost city that haunted the dreams of Spanish governors, a symbol that the conquest was never truly complete. But even myths bleed. In 1572, under the orders of the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, Spain launched a final campaign to extinguish the Inca remnant once and for all. With superior arms, seasoned soldiers, and relentless ambition, the Spanish forces cut through the jungle, burning and razing until they reached Vilcabamba. What they found was not a thriving kingdom, but a community strained by decades of isolation and war. Tupac Amaru fled, but was soon captured near the river. The final blow had been struck. The jungle that had once protected the last Inca stronghold now fell silent. Tupac Amaru was brought to Cusco, paraded like a criminal. Despite pleas from priests and sympathizers, he was publicly executed in the central plaza. His head severed, his blood spilled on the stones that once bore the feet of his ancestors. The date: September 24, 1572. It marked the official end of the Inca Empire. But death does not always mean defeat. Tupac Amaru's name would echo for centuries. His sacrifice became legend. His lineage is sacred. In the centuries that followed, revolutionaries across Latin America would resurrect his name. Each time a cry against tyranny. Each time a reminder that the heart of the Inca still beat beneath the soil. Vilcabamba was lost. But its spirit? It never died. When the Spanish finally extinguished the flame of Vilcabamba in 1572, they believed the Inca were finished. Their cities had been razed, their emperors executed, their temples dismantled stone by stone. But the Inca legacy was never merely built of stone. It was etched into memory, whispered through bloodlines, and hidden in the heartbeat of the Andes. The empire was gone, but the spirit of resistance endured. Across the centuries, the name Tupac Amaru would refuse to die. He had fallen in Cusco's plaza, yes, but his death had planted a seed deeper than any crown could bury. Among his descendants and among the millions of indigenous people now living under colonial rule, that name became a silent rebellion. It would speak again, loudly. In 1780, over 2 centuries after Tupac Amaru's execution, a man named José Gabriel Condorcanqui, a well-educated mestizo claiming direct descent from the Inca royal line, rose in rebellion. He did not just carry a grievance. He had a name. He called himself Tupac Amaru II. What began as a protest against Spanish taxation and cruelty turned into the largest indigenous uprising in colonial Spanish America. From Cusco to the highlands of Peru and Bolivia, the echo of the Inca thundered once more. Tupac Amaru II demanded an end to forced labor, to the abuses of colonial corregidors, and to the systemic oppression of indigenous people. He wore the royal sash of his ancestors and invoked the memory of the fallen empire, not out of nostalgia, but as a living legacy. Tens of thousands rallied in support of his cause. For a moment, it seemed as though history might reverse itself. Towns fell to the rebels. Spanish garrisons crumbled. The royal order trembled, but the Spanish crown reacted swiftly. The uprising was met with overwhelming military retaliation. Tupac Amaru II was captured and forced to watch the execution of his family. In a brutal and symbolic punishment, the Spanish attempted to quarter his body with horses, failing only after multiple attempts, resorting instead to beheading. The execution, meant to terrify, only immortalized him. And once again, the cycle repeated. Resistance begets legacy. Legacy beget by the 19th century. As the wars of independence spread throughout Latin America, the memory of the Inca became a symbol of freedom. Revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín stirred the Andean spirit, often referencing the cruelty of conquest and the dignity of those who resisted it. In modern Peru and Bolivia, the figure of the Inca emperor has been reinterpreted not as a relic of a past empire, but as a symbol of cultural pride. Statues of Pachacuti and Tupac Amaru stand tall in plazas where Spanish gallows once cast shadows. Indigenous languages like Quechua, once banned by colonizers, are now recognized in national constitutions. In literature, music, political activism, the story of Inca resistance lives on. And perhaps most powerfully, in the very descendants of those who once served the Sapa Inca. From the high-altitude villages of the Andes to the bustling streets of Cusco, millions today carry the bloodlines, traditions, and memory of a people who refused to vanish. Even in the darkest chapters, the burning of temples, the looting of cities, the execution of emperors, there was always resistance. It lived in hidden altars, in songs passed from mother to child, and in stories whispered under stars, too ancient for empire. The Inca did not vanish. They transformed. What Spain saw as conquest, history now recognizes as a collision of worlds, one in which the indigenous voice, though battered, never broke. And so, the legacy of the Inca is not just a tale of gold and conquest. It's a testament to endurance, to the will of a people who bent under the storm, but never let it define them. As long as the Andes rise, the spirit of the Inca rises with them. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision of entire worlds. Two civilizations, both convinced of their own divinely ordained destiny, staring into each other's eyes across a chasm of language, ritual, and understanding. One wielded steel, gunpowder, and the cross. The other, stone, spirit, and the sun. In the centuries since Pizarro's bold ambush in Cajamarca, the story of the Inca Empire has blurred the lines between history and mythology. What happened in those fateful decades has been told and retold, sometimes as a tale of Spanish heroism and civilizing mission, sometimes as one of betrayal and brutality. But the truth, as always, lies deeper. At its height, the Inca Empire was a marvel, a society that spanned from the mountains of Colombia to the deserts of Chile. Its roads connected regions like arteries. Its quipu recorded knowledge without the need for a written language. Its economy ran without coins. Its armies marched without wheels. And its capital in Cusco was planned with astronomical precision. It was not a perfect civilization. There were conquests, punishments, rigid social hierarchies, but it was ordered, sacred, and astonishingly efficient. When the Spanish arrived, they misunderstood nearly everything. They mistook ceremonial customs for submission. They misinterpreted the silence of Atahualpa as a sign of weakness. They assumed that gold meant greed, that temples meant idolatry, and that empire meant domination in the same way it did in Europe. In truth, the Inca saw themselves as stewards of the earth, their ruler as a literal child of the sun. Their empire was a web of reciprocity, bound by tribute and loyalty. Not just force. They did not build with fear alone. They built with belief. Pizarro's conquest shattered that world in just a few decades. But the Spanish conquest did more than collapse palaces. It unleashed centuries of transformation. Christianity spread, often by force, but also through syncretism. Indigenous gods were usually cloaked in the guise of saints. Festivals adapted rather than disappeared. Spanish and Quechua blended into new dialects. Colonial cities rose atop sacred foundations. Entire generations lived between two identities, neither fully Spanish nor fully Inca. This fusion gave birth to a new Latin American reality, rich in contradiction, creativity, and resilience. Today, the legacy of the Inca conquest endures in stone ruins and living bloodlines, in annual Inti Raymi festivals, in the music of charangos, and in the language of mountain traders. It lives in the way Andean farmers still terrace their crops, in the rhythm of Quechua songs echoing across highland valleys. And it lives in the questions we still ask. What does it mean to conquer? What does it mean to survive? Historians now challenge the simplistic framing of conquest. The Inca didn't simply fall. They adapted, resisted, transformed, and endured. Even under colonial rule, they preserved their identity through rituals, community structures, and memory. And the Spaniards? They too were transformed. Conquest changed them, morally, culturally, even spiritually. What began as a quest for riches became a permanent entanglement with a land they never truly understood, yet could never entirely leave. The story of the conquest is not just about how an empire came to an end. It's about how stories are shaped, who tells them, why, and what they leave out. For centuries, the Spanish chronicles dominated the narrative. They portrayed Pizarro as a cunning hero and Atahualpa as a deluded king. But modern scholarship and indigenous voices now reclaim the narrative. They illuminate the richness of the Inca worldview, the scale of loss, and the endurance of spirit. And so, as we look back at 1532, we must remember, the conquest of the Inca Empire was not the end of a people. It was the beginning of a long struggle, not just for land, but for truth. In every stone of Machu Picchu, in every thread of a woven poncho, in every whispered Quechua prayer, the story continues. Not as a relic, as a living inheritance,